The hall was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace, it was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a held breath before a blade falls. I stood at the center of the cold stone chamber, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows against the faces of the three men who held my life in their hands. Edric Halvain sat with a back as rigid as the granite throne beneath him, his eyes devoid of the warmth usually reserved for those with a wolf's soul. To his left, Lorcanver leaned forward, his narrow gaze tracing the line of my throat as if looking for the silver thread of a pack bond he knew wasn't there. Seraphine Vaelor, Matthias Crowell's voice grated like shifting gravel, heavy with a traditionalist's disgust. You have been selected. The word hung in the air, cold and final. In our world, selection was a polite word for a death sentence, usually reserved for the broken, the weak, or the wolfless. I looked at the scroll resting on the table, already signed, already sealed in black wax. They hadn't called me here to ask for my service, they had called me to announce my departure. I was being sent to the Obsidian Halls, a place where women were whispered to disappear into the shadows of the Beast King. I realized then that my 26 years of trying to be invisible had failed. I wasn't being chosen for a job, I was being discarded into the mouth of a monster. If you stop halfway through this story, you'll find yourself awake at 3 a.m., caught in a dream wondering what truly waits in the dark of the Obsidian Halls. This is a journey that demands to be finished. Welcome to Bound to the Alpha. If you are new here, please turn on your notification bell so you never miss the daily tales we drop. Like and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. When the heavy gates of the Northern Dominion groan open, you aren't entering a home, you are entering a predator's memory. The air here doesn't just feel cold, it feels ancient, thick with the scent of pine, wet stone, and old blood. The carriage ride had been a blur of gray mist, but the reality of the Obsidian Halls was sharper than a butcher's blade. As I walked down the primary corridor, my boots clicking against the polished black floor, I didn't look at the vaulted ceilings or the shimmering tapestries. I looked at the walls. At eye level, the stone was gouged, deep, frantic furrows where fingernails had once clawed for a grip that wasn't there. They were the remnants of the women who came before me, physical echoes of the terror I was supposed to feel. I traced a finger over a particularly deep mark, my wolfless skin tingling with a strange, hollow resonance. To any other woman, these marks were a warning to run. To me, they were a map of the brokenness I was sent to inhabit. I didn't tremble. I didn't look back. I followed the silent guards deeper into the heart of the fortress, toward the room where the Beast Alpha King waited to see if I, too, would leave my mark upon his walls. Or if, for the first time in his long, shadowed life, he had finally met something he couldn't tear apart. The heavy doors of the King's Solar didn't just open, they retreated, as if afraid of the man inside. Kaelthorn Dravik stood by a massive window, his back to me, his silhouette a jagged mountain of dark armor against the pale moonlight. The room smelled of ozone and ancient parchment, the scent of a power that was fraying at the edges. Every woman who enters this room leaves it on her knees, he said, his voice a low, predatory rumble that vibrated in my marrow. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with a lethal intensity. He didn't look for a greeting, he looked for submission. Bow, wolfless girl. Acknowledge the gravity of what stands before you. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. I felt the guards behind me shift, their breath hitching in anticipation of my collapse. But as I looked into those golden, tormented eyes, I felt something shift deep within the empty space where my wolf should have been. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, absolute stillness. I did not bow. I did not even lower my gaze. Instead, I watched his expression change from demand to a sharp, dangerous curiosity. At that moment, a faint, crystalline hum filled the air, and a soft, radiant blue light began to pulse from beneath my collarbones. It cast a ghostly glow across my skin, illuminating the shadows of the room. I wasn't hollow because I was broken, I was hollow because I was a reservoir, and for the first time in his life, the Beast King was looking at something he couldn't break. The walls of the Obsidian Halls didn't just hold the cold, they breathed it. It was well past midnight when the first sound reached my room, a low, visceral grinding of bone against stone that bypassed the ears and settled straight into the marrow. I didn't stay in my bed. The wolfless hum in my chest was tugging at me, guiding my feet toward the king's private balcony. In the courtyard below, Kaelthorn stood alone under the bleed of a dying moon. His battle-worn armor lay discarded on the flagstones, and his body was arching in a way that should have been impossible. I watched as his spine lengthened, thick fur erupting through skin that seemed to tear and heal in the same heartbeat. But it wasn't the shift that stopped my breath, it was the sound. It wasn't a roar of dominance. It was a rhythmic, agonizing sob. I realized then that the beast wasn't a choice he made to terrify his kingdom, it was a prison he was locked inside. Every snap of his jaw was a reflex of pain, a desperate effort to hold on to the man beneath the monster before the primal curse swallowed him whole. The world called him cruel because he pushed everyone away, but as I stood in the shadows, watching the king claw at the earth in a frantic search for relief, I saw the truth. He wasn't breaking women because he enjoyed it. He was breaking them so they wouldn't stay long enough to watch him shatter. The obsidian walls were cold, but the message tucked into the seam of my sleeve felt like a branding iron against my skin. It had appeared while I was distracted by the king's agony, a sliver of parchment delivered by a shadow that moved too fast to be human. I retreated to the dim light of my quarters, the wolfless glow in my chest flickering like a dying star as I smoothed the paper flat. It was Lorcanvair's handwriting, elegant, sharp, and utterly devoid of mercy. The vessel must remain open, the note whispered. Do not be distracted by the beast's cries. Remember the device sewn into the silk of your hem. It does not just observe, it anchors. I reached down, my fingers trembling as they found the hard, cold lump hidden within the heavy dark fabric of my gown. It was a void siphon, a piece of pre-treaty magic designed to act as a silent predator. While I stood near Kaelthorn, playing the role of the submissive maid, this device was meant to reach out and drink from his fading life force, funneling his sovereign power back to the council. They didn't want me to save him. They wanted me to be the leak that finally emptied him. I looked toward the king's wing, the sound of his ragged breathing still echoing in my mind. The council saw a monster to be harvested, but for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of the empty space they had given me. It wasn't just a vessel for their greed, it was becoming a shield. Kaelthorn found me in the library, a room of towering shelves that held more secrets than sunlight. He didn't enter so much as he invaded, the heavy click of his boots against the stone sounding like a countdown. He cornered me against a shelf of ancient, leather-bound histories, his towering frame blocking out the flickering torchlight until I was submerged in his shadow. You don't flinch, he growled, his hand slamming against the wood beside my head. His breath smelled of bitter winter and old iron. I see the light pulsing in your chest, wolfless girl. I see the weapon the council stitched into your skin. Why aren't you begging for your life? Why is your heartbeat as steady as a dead man's? He leaned in closer, his predatory eyes searching mine for the familiar flicker of terror he used to sustain his own crumbling walls. He intended to break me, to force a reaction that would justify his own monstrous reflection. But as his chest nearly brushed mine, the blue-white glow from my heart flared, radiating a frequency that wasn't sound, but stillness. It was a hum of absolute, unshakable calm, the vast, quiet power of the void. I watched the tension bleed from his jaw, his pupils dilating as the soothing nothing of my soul met the jagged chaos of his curse. For the first time, the king didn't look like a beast, he looked like a drowning man who had finally found a piece of shore. He didn't break me. He simply stopped breathing, caught in the impossible peace of a girl who had nothing left to lose. The stillness Kaelthorn left behind was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the obsidian walls of the library. My chest continued to thrum with that unnatural blue light, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate with the ancient stone. I found myself drawn to a hidden alcove behind the histories of the Northern Dominion, a space the dust had forgotten, housing a set of journals bound in blackened wolf hide. I opened the first volume, my fingers tracing the jagged, frantic script of Kaelthorn's ancestors. As I read, the cold light from my heart illuminated a truth more terrifying than any beast. The curse that ravaged the Alpha King wasn't a freak of nature or a failure of his spirit. It was a deliberate, generational architecture of ruin. Through the faded ink, I discovered the names of the men who had initiated the sovereign leak. Generations ago, the council, led by the ancestors of Seraphine and Vaelor, had introduced a slow-acting alchemical poison into the royal bloodline, designed to destabilize the wolf bond. They hadn't just been waiting for Kaelthorn to fail, they had been meticulously crafting his descent into madness for centuries. He wasn't a monster by birth, he was a masterpiece of their betrayal. I looked at the hollow glow in my own reflection and realized the council didn't just want to drain his power, they wanted to erase the only evidence of their greatest crime. They thought I was an empty vessel, but they had given me the one thing they couldn't control, the truth. The formal dinner was an exercise in staged hostility. The High Council sat across from Kaelthorn, their silver utensils clinking against porcelain like the sharpening of scalpels. Edric Halvain watched me with the predatory patience of a man waiting for a trap to spring, while Kaelthorn sat at the head of the table, his knuckles white as he fought to keep the beast behind his eyes from lunging at the men who had poisoned his blood. As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, the air began to vibrate with a low, subharmonic frequency. It started as a warmth in the center of my chest, but quickly escalated into a searing, brilliant heat. I gasped, clutching at my bodice as a radiant blue-white light erupted from my skin, piercing through the dark fabric of my gown. The council leaned forward in unison, their faces twisting into masks of triumphant greed. They thought they were seeing the vessel, finally opening to receive the king's stolen power. But as the light surged, I didn't feel like a hollow cup being filled, I felt like a sun being born. The energy wasn't flowing into me, it was reacting to me. I looked at Kaelthorn, whose own fading aura was reaching toward me like a dying flame toward a hearth. I wasn't an empty space meant to drain him. I was a battery, a massive, untapped reservoir of the very magic his bloodline had lost. I wasn't his end, I was his only chance at a beginning. Matthias Crowell stood, his chair screeching against the stone floor like a dying animal. The air in the dining hall had grown thin, vibrating with the electric blue light pouring from my chest. He didn't look at me as a woman, he looked at me as a faucet that had finally been turned on. The energy is peaked, Matthias commanded, his voice trembling with a feverish greed. Seraphine, the conclusion. Reach for the king. Let the void siphon finish what we started generations ago. Break the seal and bring us the power. I looked at Kaelthorn. He was slumped in his chair, his eyes wide and golden, watching the light from my soul wash over the dark armor he had used to hide his pain. He wasn't fighting me. He was waiting for the end he had been told was inevitable. Slowly, I reached into the hidden seam of my gown. The council leaned in, their eyes glinting with the expectation of his death. But I didn't pull out the device. I pulled out the ancient, black waxed scroll they had forced upon me in the Hall of Judgments, the document that legally bound the king to his execution and me to my role as his murderer. With a gaze fixed on Matthias, I didn't reach for Kaelthorn. Instead, I gripped the parchment and channeled the searing, wolfless heat from my heart into my hands. The scroll ignited in a flash of brilliant blue flame, turning to ash before it could hit the table. The silence that followed was absolute. I had just burned the law, and in the king's eyes, I saw the first spark of a man who realized he was no longer alone. The heavy, suffocating silence of the hall was broken not by a scream, but by the low, resonant thrum of a power that had no name. As the ashes of the council's scroll drifted to the floor, I felt a massive, steady presence materialize at my back. Kaelthorn didn't move toward me to strike or to claim, he moved to anchor. I felt the heat of his battle-worn armor radiating against my shoulders, his towering frame casting a shadow that finally felt like a sanctuary instead of a cage. For the first time, the Beast Alpha King wasn't looking at me with predatory hunger. He stood behind me, his hands resting near his blades, his golden eyes fixed on the elders with a terrifying, lucid clarity. He was no longer a monster losing his humanity, he was a king who had found his source. Together, our dual energies, his raw, ancient magic and my cool, infinite reservoir, braided together into a single, sovereign force that made the torches flare with blue-white fire. Edric Halvain recoiled, his face pale with the realization that the vessel was now the shield. We turned as one to face the men who had spent centuries crafting our ruin. The war wasn't over, but the era of our submission ended in that breath. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this journey. Your support is what breathes life into these characters. If you felt the tension of the Obsidian Halls, please hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. Did you see the Council's betrayal coming? Stay close, because the Alliance is just beginning.